Hello everyone, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show. I'm so pleased to introduce my guest today, composer, improviser, harpsichordist, and organist Nicola Canzano. He is the composer of his first Book of Partimenti, Preludes, Fugues, Rondeaus, and Puzzles, 24 in total through all key signatures. He is also the founder of the upcoming New York and Montreal-based group Nuova Practica, which focuses on composing and improvising in baroque and early adjacent music. Hey Nicola, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show.
Hi Nikhil, thanks so much for having me.
Tell me about your background and how did you get into historical performance, partimenti, and all these related things?
I can remember actually pretty clearly how I got into historical performance. I had originally gone to school at the University of Michigan. My first undergrad degree was in music composition. And at the end of my first year there, I sort of realized, hey, I'm a composition student, and I've never actually listened to Handel's Messiah all the way through. So that was pretty shameful. And, so that summer I made a point to fill in that gap and some other ones. And I picked up, a score, and I picked up a recording. And the recording happened to be a recording by the English Baroque soloists. And I remember hearing this and just being utterly blown away by the sound of a period ensemble and just completely enamored and enchanted by all of the detail work and the continuo playing and just the clarity and brilliance and sparkle of it. And I signed up for harpsichord lessons the next year. And
were you a pianist before that?
Yeah, I grew up playing the piano.
Okay. Were you an improviser growing up? Did you compose as well growing up before you got into this?
Absolutely. Yeah, I had done that for most of my life. I improvised and I composed in early styles, but I composed in sort of lots of different styles growing up too.
When you improvised and composed, what was your theoretical thought process when you were doing that? Were you using figured bass, continuo as well, or did you have a different conception?
When I was younger, I would sort of go through phases. I had like a phase where I obsessed over Chopin and listened to pretty much nothing but that and wrote in that style for about a year. Did the same thing with Mahler and then Mozart and Shostakovich. And I didn't actually learn figured bass until I got to college and started taking harpsichord lessons. But after that, my world, I think, changed completely. And I did start thinking very much.
No, there's a little jump there for me that I'm very interested in is when you say you have like a Chopin phase, and how are you able to compose in that style just from playing the music? How do you break it down like that? Because that's like a jump. Like what? You can just compose? How do you do that?
Well, I think part of it honestly has to do with I'm sort of unluckily a rather obsessive guy. And so when I say that I had a Chopin phase, I mean it was a Chopin phase. I listened to pretty much nothing but Chopin for, a year or so. And I did the same thing with Couperin, like 10 years ago or so. And I think completely inundating yourself with a style and really just digging deep in the scores and, maybe copying a few scores and just really listening to the same things over and over again. Sort of like somebody who, doesn't speak French but gets dropped in the middle of Paris and has to live there for a year. You learn how to speak French.
Okay, wonderful. So let's place the time at the beginning of your harpsichord lessons. Yeah, so how did your journey begin?
Well, like I said, I signed up for harpsichord lessons after I heard that Messiah recording. And my first harpsichord teacher was Ed Parmentier, whose name has come up a few times in the group. I think there's a few other of his students roaming around the world today still doing early music. And he was just a real sort of erudite guy, very lovable. And he knew just about everything there was to know about harpsichord playing, about performance practice.
What year was this?
This was, let me think. I graduated high school in 2009, so this is 2011, I think I started. Yeah. And he made sure that we knew he tried to impart as much knowledge as he could to us.
No, actually, one thing that's interesting is you also are a physicist. Is that right? Did you study physics? And that's really smart. Were you doing composition and physics?
I was, yeah. So, it's all connected. When I really started getting into harpsichord and early music, I sort of realized I really wanted to just be writing early music. And I think that I was guided to that by some composition teachers who noticed, some strong influences in the way that I talked and the sparkle in my eyes when I talked about harpsichord. And they said, well, why don't you just do that? Why not? And, so I started writing early music in earnest, even though I had sort of always throughout my life, played with it here and there. And when I realized that I sort of wanted to compose early music seriously, I kind of thought, well, there goes any hope of a living. So I might as well do something else to make money. And at the time, I happened to be, interested in physics and found myself reading about it quite a bit. And so I thought, what the heck? I ended up stopping doing that because it took time away from music.
Right. Now, wait, some people say that math and music are interconnected. What's your verdict on that?
Well, I think math and music are interconnected in the fact that they're both art forms. Mathematics is usually lumped in with things like the sciences and engineering, but I think it's actually quite separate. At the end of the day, mathematics is just a way of describing the world around you, and there's no actual end goal. In the way that there is end goals in physics and in research science and even in engineering, which is in applied science. I think math is more similar to painting and music because it's a way of describing the world, and mathematicians will often use the same terms that we use to describe wonderful theorems and things like that. They'll say it's elegant, they'll say it's beautiful, they'll say it's well structured, things like that.
Has math helped you in music?
Studying physics has helped me, I think, learn to solve problems in general. You have to, I think in order to have success in physics, you have to be able to take a problem and break it down to its most basic components and say, okay, what do I need to know? What do I already know? And how do I get there? And this way of thinking has, helped me solve compositional problems. It's helped me formulate curricula for students. It's helped me finish and edit compositions and study scores and things like that, because it sort of, I think, guides my thinking in a way that's helpful and incremental.
Why the harpsichord? Now, this is a question, I think, for people who are not familiar with the harpsichord. The piano is a very popular instrument. What is it about the harpsichord that's very appealing to you?
Sometimes not much. Harpsichord, it's a gorgeous instrument. And I think, the fact that all of these instruments today are handmade and not factory made, there's something quite beautiful about that. There's a relationship you can have with the builder. There's a relationship you can have with the instrument. It requires a lot of care. Almost like a pet. The harpsichord, I think, has really, I associate it with the sound of old music, and so it sounds nice to me. But more so than that, I think it just feels really nice. There's something special about sitting down to a harpsichord and really kind of, to sound it incredibly,
go for it.
Feel at one with it. You know what I mean? When you sort of feel like it's working with you, and you can really sort of feel each plectrum come up from below the string. It's a tactile experience that I really love, I think, more than anything else.
Have you found that you had to change some ways of thinking from piano to harpsichord?
Well, I never considered myself a pianist. I always sort of considered myself a composer before I considered myself a harpsichord player and all of that. So I was never deeply entrenched in the piano world, I think, luckily, because it seems like a very competitive one. I do know lots of excellent pianists, and I think in general keyboard players are smart people. Musicians in general are smart people. But there is a lot of, I think, romantic thinking in general. And this applies to lots of things. This applies sort of ideologically too, that I think have sort of poisoned our way of thinking. It's not just, the people who play, Bach all legato or Bach all staccato or, sing, they'll sing Handel like it's Wagner or something like that. And those are pedagogical sort of faults. And I think the root of those problems lies in the Romantic era.
When did you start learning counterpoint and applying that to your composing?
Well, I think in some sense immediately. I was lucky to have good teachers who, tried to, I think, encourage my excitement about this type of thing. But from a very young age, I sort of took the initiative to, without any, formal training in species counterpoint and things like that, I took it upon myself to try and just simply learn to do, what these people who I absolutely adored did. And to that end, I would spend a lot of time poring over scores, and I would copy notes, and I would copy Bach, I would copy out Mozart, I would just write it down, and I'd spend a lot of time listening, and whenever I listened, I would listen with the score. And you end up learning a few things this way, just by sort of osmosis. And then, when I got to, I think it was middle school or high school that I started actually learning species counterpoint.
Oh my gosh! So I thought you were in college. You were in middle school and high school. Oh wow. Okay.
I had some wonderful, like I said, I had some wonderful teachers. And I'm a huge
that is
nerd.
Awesome. Wow.
Huge nerds get together. And when I did finally start learning about species counterpoint, you have a basis for these things, and it's not that I already knew how to do everything perfectly, but I had developed, by the point that I started learning all of this technical stuff and all the jargon, some good intuition just by spending a lot of time swimming in this stuff.
Now, you mentioned you had a Mahler phase. So were you exposed to more modern music theoretical concepts, Roman numerals, function theory? Did you get into that when you listened to more, you could say, later composers?
I went to school for composition. And of course, I had to do all of that stuff. Yes, I was exposed to it. I had to do all of those analyses and things like that. I don't really actually have much of an opinion or a relationship, with those things. I think it's useful, both the figured bass sort of view, and I think the Roman numeral view is useful too for its own. It has its own merits. So I sort of think in a hybrid fashion. But thankfully, I don't have to. I'm not a theory professor, thankfully, so I haven't yet had to sort out, my real, my real.
Right. Let's get into that probably at the final section on music education. But now this is more about you right now. So I want to ask, when did you get into partimento?
Well, actually, somewhat recently. When I decided. So I was in school for physics, and I had decided that I was doing more and more music things, and I didn't really, have time for it. And I of course, my first and truest love was music. So I left that world. And when I did that, I sort of, reevaluated and thought, okay, what are the skills that I really want to develop? And my very dear friend, Nathan Mondry, whose compositions I've shared recently, he was going to school at the time in Basel studying organ improvisation. And he was learning to do things like improvise fugues and, improvise fantasias and preludes and dances and things like that. These were things I had always sort of toyed around with, but certainly had never thought about in any sort of, deliberate way. We had sort of started talking about a concert where we would, sort of a dueling harpsichords type of thing, where we would both sort of improvise, at and with each other. And this concert did finally happen 2 years ago. So basically I learned to, in earnest to improvise in preparation for that. And I started looking through Partimenti and things like that. My first book was actually the Langlots manuscript, or Langlots, you actually pronounce it.
And so you had extensive experience with continuo. Was it easy for you to get into the partimento?
Yes, I think continuo is a huge, huge, huge step to understand. It's just a huge window into, I think, understanding all of these things. I often tell my non-keyboard colleagues who may or may not know figured bass, that my musicianship increased threefold when I learned continuo. And all my students, I start out with continuo, the same way that I learned continuo. Because well-written partimento, you can sort of play it as a figured bass piece. And if you're doing anything besides just, playing block chords, and even if you're doing that and it's a really nice bass line, then you've got a perfectly valid partimento realization.
What is the difference then, in your mind, the difference between realizing partimento and realizing continuo?
Well, I don't want to fall into a trap here because I'm sure there are people who've studied
Believe me,
this.
I am not laying traps. I really don't know.
I don't want to get any private messages from professors. You've misrepresented Partimento.
Yeah.
But I sort of view it as an advanced solo piece for a continuo player. And I think continuo player doesn't necessarily mean keyboard. I think somebody who understands how to figure a bass line and realizes that there are many musical possibilities above that already has the skills to follow the slightly more complicated roadmap that is Partimento. And it just takes some practice, I think, to get used to, which clues to look for and, which parts of the page you should be looking at and things like that. But the strategies are similar. There's just different sort of priorities, I think.
So you mentioned the Langlois manuscript. What collections of Partimenti did you work on, and which collections do you like?
Well, I mean, all of them and none of them. I worked first with the Langlois manuscript, and then I think next with the Handel. And then after that, I worked with Fenaroli and Sala, and I found those all sort of very disappointing because I just there are a few real good ones I think in the Langlois manuscript, and maybe I was spoiled. But also there's
you're talking about musically, is that right?
Yes, yeah, totally. Okay. So it's sort of like it's sort of like trying like a Wagyu burger as your first burger and then being taken to McDonald's or something like that. Maybe it's not so bad, but Fenaroli 1 is not it's not meant to be a masterpiece. That's not what this music is for. And so I don't want to be a curmudgeon at all. This music was not written to be a symphony number 9. And it achieves its goal extremely well. It's a pedagogical book.
And so so if that's the case, then what are really musical examples in your mind of Partimenti collections?
Well, I don't really know that I would say that I adore any collection of Partimenti for their purely musical merits. That was one of the impetuses for me to write my own book of Partimenti, because I really wanted to write Partimenti that were sort of satisfying on a both on a pedagogical level, but also in a musical sense, and were sort of theoretically sound as compositions. But there are, of course, quite a few, Partimenti scattered throughout these collections that I really admire as pieces of music. And I think they're, and Partimenti as good pieces of music, they offer things that other very good pieces of music don't, because they're, one of the qualities of a good Partimento, I think, is that it's flexible. And that's a pretty unique quality, I think, in music. We usually think, oh, this is a great piece. You take out a note and the whole thing falls apart. And there's something, there's something exquisite about that. And I think there's something exquisite also about, you can play this piece at this tempo, you can play it at this tempo, you can play it at this tempo. You can add this section, you can take away this one, you can transpose it. You can put this theme on top, you can put that theme on top, you can do this section in canon. And also you can play it sort of plainly as a solo. And, if it works also in all those ways, there's something truly beautiful about that only sort of Partimento can achieve.
Right. Now, you mentioned that your collection is for advanced students. Just as a comparison, would that be like Fenaroli's final books? Is that kind of a fair kind of level of difficulty?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a fair comparison.
And that's dealing with fugues, and you mentioned preludes, rondeaus, and puzzles as well.
Yeah, those were put in at the request of a few friends who seem to like musical puzzles, and I was happy to do it because by the end of the book, I was sort of happy to be done. And puzzles are easier to write than Partimenti.
Now, okay, wait. Now this is okay. So let's talk now about counterpoint and how do you get to that level where you can weigh scores and understand things? And is this a really difficult art to grasp and to master?
I think anybody who has done something for a long time and truly loves it would never tell anybody else who's interested that it's hard, because of course anything that you love sort of seems easy, and also I think the question you asked is a bit sort of like the question that musicians get asked all the time, which is, oh, how did you get to where you are? And we can get into specifics. But,
all right, that's perfect then. Let's get into specifics, okay? Because that's what the people want. So let's. Okay, so how should somebody start?
Well, I mean, I think they should start by having an appreciation for the type of music that employs these strategies. And I think that's sort of a given for most of the people who are interested in learning counterpoint. I don't think there are people out there interested in learning 18th century counterpoint that don't like 18th century music. It starts with, I think, truly a desire to understand how this music is put together. From there, there are different approaches you can take. I think for myself and a lot of music students, we're not, at least, hopefully this will change in the future. But I think, people who are of a certain age and older, did not have the luxury of being brought up in an early music tradition from the get-go. And so, they didn't start writing and improvising and learning figure bass when they were children, but later. And at that point, you have sort of all of these tools that you've gotten from other places that help you along the way that you don't need to be retaught. So to answer the question, how do you start from scratch? I could probably, be better. I could probably better answer that in about 10 years when I, have hopefully more, have taught more children and more students from nothing. But I encourage my own students that I start with continuo. I definitely start with continuo, and I start them doing something called harmony boxing, which is how I learned continuo from Ed Parmentier. And this is just a way for them to sort of get going immediately. And then from there, we also study the compositions that we've realized. And we look at the structure, and voice leading is sort of learned by correction of hand patterns, and then by writing these things down.
Would you recommend a teacher?
I think it's good to have a teacher. Yeah, of course. I think for continuo especially, I think it'd probably be easier to learn continuo than counterpoint with a teacher. I think counterpoint you could maybe copy enough scores and consult enough books.
You mentioned being dropped into Paris and trying to figure out French. What is the musical equivalent of being dropped into the 18th century, in terms of the repertoire? So you mentioned a Couperin phase. Is he a great example of somebody who's just really a master at counterpoint and writing that should be thoroughly explored?
Oh, you pressed a button. I hope you'll have to stop me because I could go on forever.
No, please.
Who I think is really an incredibly underappreciated composer. And I'll tell you precisely what I think Couperin does so well. And first I'll say that I really think he deserves to be sitting on a throne sort of right next to Bach. I think he's known as a keyboard composer, but his chamber music is truly exquisite. And what I believe he does better than anybody else is sort of embody the Baroque ideal of independence of parts. And his two-part music, and his trios, and I don't think he's ever written anything in more than, well, that's wrong. He's written some masses. Sorry. I don't think he's written any instrumental music in more than 3 parts. He has an uncanny ability to write simultaneous melodies to the point that if you were to play any one single voice of any of his duos or trios by itself, it would work perfectly well as a solo. Wow. And that's not something that you can say about, something like the Art of Fugue. Now, granted, it's an unfair, I think, standard to hold something like the Art of Fugue to, because the Art of Fugue is principally a keyboard piece. But it's certainly something that Bach also thought about, and I think and they achieved it totally differently. I think this is the reason that Bach makes all of these contrapuntal compromises that are so often argued about sometimes on our favorite groups, and why you see some cross relations and some.
So you're saying if you compare Couperin and Bach, so Couperin has less of those compromises?
Well, yeah, and I think the reason for that is that Couperin's music. So Couperin pays a premium for being able to have simultaneous melodies that are so poetic, and also vertically, by which I mean harmonically, perfect and clear. Lots of thirds and sixths. The harmony is always crystal clear. And to achieve those two things, he has to give up complexity to a certain extent. So this is why he doesn't, often write in any more than 2 or 3 parts. And Bach would like to do all of those things. He would like to have the independence, and he would like to have complexity, and he would like to be able to write in 4 parts most of the time. And I think in order to do that, he has to sometimes have things like, parallel sevenths, and crazy dissonances, and, passing tones that Couperin probably wouldn't tolerate. I think Couperin's music is cleaner in general than Bach. That is not at all a statement, about a superior quality. It's a difference in approach. And so in some sense, I think they're sort of incomparable.
How did he learn music? Was he a product of the 18th century, very similar to kind of like how Bach did with figured bass?
Couperin, if I remember correctly, he came from a musical family, and of course his uncle Louis Couperin was also a very famous composer, and Louis Couperin had 2 brothers, one of which was the father of François, Charles, I think, and so Charles oversaw, Couperin's musical education when he was very young. But Charles died, I think, when Couperin was 10 or so. Similar, actually.
Wow. Okay, that's just like Bach, right?
Story. Yeah, and actually, a few of these composers have similar childhoods. I find it fascinating. But
is he older than Bach? How?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, he is a bit older than Bach and died, I think, 20 or 30 years before Bach. Okay. So he was brought up at first by his father. His father died, and then his mother was very, very keen on making sure that he, sort of completed, sort of fulfilled what was already set out for him. And one of the court organists, Michel Delalande, a composer, I think. Is his first name Michel? I don't know. Delalande. I don't want to misspeak here. Delalande finished his education, and I think by 15 or 16, he was already the organist at Saint-Gervais.
What pieces can you recommend for people to check out if they want to improve their 2-part or 3-part keyboard writing?
Well, I mean, the Bach conventions and symphonias are excellent for 2-part writing. I mean, the French Baroque style is, to some people, sort of unapproachable because of all this dense ornamentation, and there's so many stylistic things. But and I've heard from lots of people that they would never start any keyboard player on Couperin, and I can see why. He's sort of a sadist. But his instrumental music, I mean, Les Goûts Réunis and the Concert Royaux, those are, I think, incredible pieces of music and wonderful models of 2-part counterpoint. Just the way that the melodies sort of lilt separately and together. The phrasing is nice and clear, and it's I think a great introduction to simple sort of poetic structures and effective 2-part writing with an emphasis on melodic counterpoint.
Do you have a comment on Scarlatti? I've been introduced to him by Enrico Baiano, and I like him very much. Another person I respect said he's kind of like an unguided missile, and that he's brilliant. But Enrico Baiano said he's just so vast and brilliant that you can't really pigeonhole him into one kind of description. What do you think of Scarlatti?
You answered my question. Yeah, so I mean, of course, I like Scarlatti as much as the next guy. I don't disagree at all with the assessment that he's sort of an unguided missile. I think Scarlatti might have taken such a comment as a badge of honor. I'm a big fan of his father, Alessandro. I think he's quite an underappreciated composer. I think his Magnificat and some of his oratorios are truly incredible. Domenico, what I appreciate most about him is sort of his economy of writing. He was not afraid to sort of, write in octaves for a bass line, or just, use 2 voices here and then 7 there. And sort of, he creates a lot of effect with very little. And it's clear that he wrote these things quite quickly. So, and he figured out his own form. They study this in their own way with the crux and etc. And I think for all those reasons, Scarlatti deserves my praise. His style is not entirely my cup of tea, but I have nothing but good things to say about him most of the time.
Let's get back to that step-by-step training. So the continuo, we stopped at some great examples of the literature that we can use as models. Let's assume we're getting better at starting to do continual realizations. How do we get better at composing now, writing and counterpoint? Should we start with something like Fugues, or are there other ways?
So, I've read through Fugues. I've read some of these books, and I personally don't find them that helpful. But I think that might have something to do with the fact that they've sort of the questions that those books seek to answer. I think I had sought and answered in other ways by the time I arrived at them. But I'm at the point now where I'm teaching, so I'm reevaluating all of these things as great possibilities and seeing what works for different people. I mean, one thing that I didn't find helpful was the rule of the octave, but of course I had already been playing continuo for 5 years when I sort of came across that, and I find that students adore the rule of the octave and find it very helpful. Most of them, not all of them, so that's something I teach now.
Is that because you're so experienced that it's too restrictive?
No, if you've been playing continuo for years, the rule of the octave is something that you would have done a bunch of times just by playing music, or realizing basses. The rule of the octave it answers the question, how do you realize stepwise motion, essentially. But getting back to your initial question, which is how do people start learning to compose after they've begun to learn continuo? I think the skills that you pick up, in learning continuo is sort of a bit of how to push your fingers around. And if you're doing it right, you sort of have an idea of, at the very least, what the correct, notes are and maybe how to avoid the most egregious of counterpoint errors. So already, you're playing in 4 parts. And you already know not to write octaves or fifths, and presumably you have some intuition about passing tones and things like that. That you shouldn't leap to a dissonance, and you shouldn't accented dissonances are special, and all of these other matters. And these all come up in the study of continual playing. They all come up because you would like to decorate things, or you'd like to connect certain things. You might want to roll a chord into the next one, or take out this note or that note, and all of these things forces you to consider things that are at the root of it, counterpoint issues. So when you start writing these things down, sort of writing down what you're doing with your hand, you realize that you're sort of already like halfway there in learning how to write in 4 parts, and you have intuitions, and better yet, your intuitions are in your fingers. And it's just about sort of now looking at them. So we start realizing, in writing, the basses that we've been realizing on the keyboard, and start, sort of looking at it with a different kind of microscope, one that has, greater magnification, but also one that's sort of looking for different things. You start looking for form, and form is something that very much feeds into improvisation, and vice versa. And so all these things are quite interrelated. And so I think you can sort of start from anywhere and learn things, and anywhere meaning composition, improvisation, or continuo and performance technique. And you'll learn things about the others. And so it's just about sort of where exactly you want to begin. I think continuo is my personal favorite door, because it gets people playing, and it gets them in contact with the music that they love, and which presumably has brought them to seek a teacher to learn how to do more of this. And from there, once you learn a bit about one of these things, you realize that you've learned a bit about everything else. And when you begin examining them in more detail, you have a head start.
Now, do you recommend starting with 2 voices or 3 voices or 4 or more voices when playing continuo?
Fascinating question, and I'm fascinated that you've asked this to a few of your other guests too, and actually it came up recently in one of the groups, and I made the comment that, I think two-voice fugues is a very advanced topic, and that, I think that four-voice fugues should probably precede the study of two-voice fugues. This is just an opinion, of course, but the way that I see it, I think you can start studying two-part music in, as it relates to, good melodies and things like that, and things that go together and things to aim for. And I don't think there's any harm in that. But I think in general, it's more difficult to write two-part music because there's less places for you to hide. Both voices are going to be incredibly apparent to anybody listening, even the uninitiated listener. And you have sort of more, more things to do. You have to make sure that the harmony is always clear, and that's a lot harder to do with two voices than it is for four. You have to make sure everything is sort of in the right proportion with each other, just like you do with four voices, but it's just a little more treacherous. So I think if you have an understanding of how you want harmonies to go, which are, of course, clearer in four voices, then you can have a better idea of how to approximate it in two voices, either by, blocking out certain chords or certain figures that outline a chord or other harmonies, etc.
Now, what about getting into a little bit more complex contrapuntal ideas like fugues and canons and that sort of thing?
Well, for me, the way that I learned how to do these things was just to try and do it, and I would try to do it, and then I'd identify things that I think were not going well, problems. And with canon specifically, I am going through this at the moment, and have only sort of just started, some real intense study of canons. And our friend Erickson Hatfield is writing a whole book about such a thing at the moment. With fugues, I had done it since I was younger, but in any case, it's the same strategy. You try to approximate the fugues and canons that you like, and you try to identify points of failure, and you go back and you look at maybe how you can alleviate these defects that you find, and these defects can take the form of, this canon, sounds like a run-on sentence. This canon, it's dissonant here, and I don't know how this is going to work out. And so, for the first thing, you might ask, okay, well, how do people include cadences? How do people include, phrase structure within canons and fugues? And, for the second thing, you have to sort of just learn how to push notes around. And to do that, to sort of uncover the harmonic structure of these things, you can try to identify things that are, quote unquote, decorative, and sort of try to undress the fugue subject as much as you can. And when you do that, you end up writing out sort of in whole notes and half notes or something like that, for example. And you can see why it works so easily, very clearly. It turns out to be, actually, I can play you an example.
Oh, great!
Probably,
yeah.
A very, very, very simple example. You would just be something like this. And at its core, that's just. Right? And so you already sort of know how to harmonize a scale downward, theoretically. And you can do things. And then when you decorate it, that still works. Right? So, and this is actually sort of one of the ways that I practice fugue improv, which is sort of taking schemata, which are just simple little, idioms and ditties that you find all around 18th century music, and sort of harmonizing them in a bunch of different ways and putting them in different voices, and then decorating them. And when your hands know what to do with the simple stuff, then they can sort of know what to do with the complicated stuff. Requires a bit of extra practice, but nowhere near as much if you just thought, okay, I want to improvise a fugue right now. And with composition, it's exactly the same way. I mean, you try to you take the problem and you try to undress it as much as you can and reduce it to its most basic components, just like a physics problem.
Now, this is a question that is I wanted to ask: how do you Are you able, with this knowledge, to look at compositions and say, this works, this is not as effective? Are you able to just look at something and say, okay, this is why it works, this is why it doesn't work so well, and it's just so clear as day for you?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that. I think I would say I've done this long enough that I have developed opinions and tastes on what things I like, and I have, I have my own priorities when I compose. I have things that I love when I listen to music, and of course, all these things inform what your music sounds like and what music you listen to, and of course, it will eventually inform what types of criticisms you make. So, I mean, I definitely wouldn't say, oh, it's clear as day to me why I think this piece works or this doesn't. I'm not sort of the arbiter of quality, in that way. But I certainly have opinions about what I think music should do and what I think excellently written music should accomplish. And, to those ends, I've sought out how I think those things might be achieved by the people that I think achieve them. And so, yeah, I mean,
So that's at a high level, but just at a basic level, I mean, for a lot of people, and I would put myself in that group, if somebody says, look, I've written a fugue, and then I hear a bunch of notes happening, I think, wow, that's got to be good, I think. I can't tell if something is good or not, then that's what really bothers me right now.
But yeah, I mean, I would certainly have opinions. I mean, one comment I find myself making constantly, which I think is indicative of my personal priorities, is this, I say all the time, like, oh, this doesn't have enough cadences, or, this voice sounds like a run-on sentence, or, I feel like the music needs to be more porous. I say some variation of that. I feel like a broken record. And I think this comes from, that comes from two places. It comes from one, holding all music that I listen to this standard of independence of parts, which is certainly a Baroque ideal. And so I really do think that everything should be an independent melody that should work by a solo piece by itself. Okay. And the other thing is from, poetry and like, oh, it's such a buzzword. I hate saying it, but like, rhetorical considerations. Is the piece sort of well structured? Is it put together? I mean, do we have nice, easy, digestible things laid out at the beginning that, that make sense, that we can sort of pocket for later? When the piece goes on, are these things, embellished? Are they stretched out? How exactly is the point elaborated? Do we get an inversus? Do we go into minor? In the case of Couperin, do the phrase lengths get more irregular? What harmonic territories do we go into relative to what was introduced in the beginning? So I sort of, those are a few things that I tend to obsess over when I listen to music and when I write.
If we're going to study fugue, I mean, there are different types, right? So, and within those types, there's also variations there, right? So how do we learn how to write? It's correct, but we can also put our stamp on it.
Well, I think, first, I think you should have some. You should have some tastes, and you should have some priorities. And unfortunately, the people who don't, you'll sort of get at first. You'll get your teacher's priorities, which is fine at first. And as you progress, you will develop sort of your own opinions, just like we were just discussing. But if the question is how does one begin to write fugues, I would start by analyzing your favorite fugues. But another reason that I wrote the Book of Partimenti was sort of to try and figure out a few things about composition, specifically about form, and try to answer the question: what's the bare minimum I can do to create a satisfying and structurally sound prelude and a satisfying and structurally sound fugue? And of course, the strategies that you employ to achieve those things, I think, are different for preludes and fugues, but also there are many similarities. If you want me to be quite specific, I mean, I think fugue form is a good introduction, I think, to rhetorical considerations in music, because it's quite rigid, the exposition, right? You're not expected as much in a fugue as you were to, for example, in something like a sonata or a free form, sort of Baroque first movement. You're not expected to create your own structure for laying out the initial points because fugue expositions are so constricted structurally. So you have your subject, you have your answer, and you have the counter subject underneath it. You typically then have an episode, and then I like to have one more entrance or two that sort of wraps it up, or maybe the episode comes last as sort of a culmination of all the entrances. But essentially, all the voices enter. You have a little party with them in the form of an episode, and maybe you have another entrance or two, and then you've wrapped up your exposition. And at that point, you then start asking the question, okay, well, what can I do with this? And that question, could involve, can this be strettoed? And can I put it in augmentation? Can I flip it upside down? And these are all just contrapuntal tricks. But maybe you want to go into a completely different section. Maybe you want to introduce some new. Bach does this all the time. Maybe you want to introduce some material that's brand new after the fugue exposition, and then sneak the fugue back in there. And of course, it's all reverse engineered, right? He's probably playing the subject and reading like, oh, this would be nice underneath it. And then you take the fugue subject away and it's like, well, this works by itself. And you can sort of develop that by itself. And then, you sound like, a sort of mad scientist genius when the fugue comes back in of this thing that you've designed it to go underneath. So I think studying fugue form is a really good lesson in sort of rhetoric. It can teach you about priorities. You should maybe put certain things like stretto and certain, really advanced devices sort of nearer to the end. You should put maybe simpler phrase structures near the beginning. And it's a great exposure into other sort of, compositional and contrapuntal tricks. So as advanced as it is, there's really a lot to be learned. And then from there, you can say, oh, okay, well, I really want to learn, about harmonic structure in form. And then, for that, we can go look at some other things, that are maybe a little clearer than Bach. Corelli I'm a huge fan of Corelli. So yeah, fugues are a good window into a lot of these other things.
For you, what theoretical concept do you use when you're writing these things?
Well, for example, it depends on what we're analyzing. If you're talking about harmony specifically, I will usually write a fundamental bass underneath something. So, for example, if I'm writing a fugue together with a student, we may start with a schemata and put them together and then decorate them to create a subject. Or
by the way, schemata, is that like the Yerdigan schema?
Yeah, I used to call them fugue molecules, but they're really just they're really just schemata. I just mean little 3 or 4 note patterns that you find constantly in Baroque music.
So this could be like the Galant schemata. It could be like bass motions, sequences,
sure,
that sort of stuff. Okay,
I'll give you a few examples.
Okay.
Or, these just tiny little things, these little molecules that get put together to create compounds that are then decorated to create, melodies and subjects and themes.
You played a do re mi. Do you, so that in the bass you can go 1-7-1, something like that. So basically these basic forms.
Right. Yeah, and you can do, you can do other things with it too. You can, of course, you can just do, or you can do, or you can do lots of things. And so we'll, if we're working with a tune that we're trying to either write a fugue on or maybe harmonize, we'll write a fundamental bass underneath it, and we'll figure it, and then we'll play it. We'll play it as continuo, and then we'll play it the bass line with the thing that we're trying to understand, and we can learn about the different harmonic possibilities and sort of tendencies of the subject.
Great. That's really fantastic. Why did I start this so late in life? Okay, so anyway,
never too late.
Yeah, let's tie this into music education, because I'm really interested in your thoughts in reforming, or rather just ideas that you have that could really help educators today. Because you're a teacher yourself, and you're helping young people learn music and learn how to compose and improvise. Now, one thing is, this is 18th century music and earlier, but I mean, my impression of partimento and continuo and all of that is that it's all just, I mean, even though, yes, if you want to be absolutely specific to a particular era, yes, you follow it exactly with the models. But how do you feel about this information in more contemporary settings? Do you feel there's relevance for this information to be applied in perhaps a different setting, and you can see parallels there, or no?
What do you mean?
So, for instance, let's say, okay, I have a thorough understanding of continuo. Somebody says, hey, I need you to write a musical for me, or write a pop song or something. And I mean, would that be useful information in your mind for a student?
I mean, I suppose the underlying presumption is that this musical is in a much more contemporary sort of modern musical type of time. I mean, so essentially the question is, does, this way of thinking about things and the type of things that you learn and the type of viewpoints that one might learn to have via, studying things like early music composition and continuo, do those apply to the greater musical world?
Exactly.
Or are they only applicable within, the style?
Right, because, if we go to a music college, they're going to teach us Roman numerals, function theory, and that's from the 19th century. And they say, we can apply that to anything from Chick Corea to musical theater and all of that. So is it the same for figured bass? So what do you think?
I mean, I think absolutely. Yeah, I think absolutely. I think really pop music is pretty much just Baroque music. And I think jazz is really all the things that we're trying to learn. I think they've figured out a few decades ago, and they just happen to do it in a slightly different style. But I think that's the extent of our differences, I think, may almost end there. And I think there is tons of overlap between jazz and early music. And it's something that I really have been meaning to more fully explore for some time and get together with some jazz musicians and really just kind of try to learn as much as I can from them. Because, they do the same things. They practice licks and they practice, there's forms and there's progressions. There's things underlying them when they're playing, and they know sort of exactly where they are in the piece and what the possibilities are. And they have a much more refined, I think, understanding of improvisatory music and in some sense of maybe even, musical structure and things like that, because they have to be able to do what they do. So, I mean, I think all of these things are totally related and applicable to most styles of music. I mean, would I write
in a general sense, right? In a general sense.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't write out a figured bass to, a Shostakovich symphony. I don't know how much I would learn doing that. But I think, like I said, I mean, you could undress it a bit and take out some of those dissonances, and you might learn, which things are sort of fundamental to his sound, and which things are, very old constructions. So yeah, I don't really know that there's too many limitations to this way of thinking.
This counterpoint right now, so we were talking about 18th century counterpoint, 17th century counterpoint. Maybe it's an obvious thing, but like 20th century counterpoint, 19th century counterpoint. What do we do there with these, for instance, unprepared dissonances and that sort of thing? I mean, what's your perspective on learning counterpoint in a more contemporary setting? The 20th century and maybe even the 21st century.
The first thing I would say is I don't know that I'm the best guy to ask, but I will try, because I at least have an opinion whether or not it's the most sort of erudite or informed one. But I think what changes over time in music, at least up to a point, once the second Viennese school started and all that, a lot of things sort of went out the window. But I think mostly what changed is just sort of taste. I mean, I think the fundamentals didn't change that much. I mean, the fact that it sort of sounds bad to have like all of your voices, moving in the same direction all the time has sort of always been true. You don't want, your parts to be jumping around a lot. That's sort of always been true. You want sort of harmonies to be spaced a certain way. For example, it sounds a lot better if you space things more akin to how the overtone series is laid out, or more basically, you sort of want harmonies closer together up top rather than the harmonies closer together at the bottom and more spread out on top. Certain things like this have always been true, and a general good voice leading technique and all of that remains true. And these things, I think, sort of actually might be getting at some really deep questions about music that they might have something to do with sort of language and syntax. I mean, we for the same reason that we don't like it when people talk like this,
Yep.
we don't like listening to music like that either. Most of our works are sort of very close to the same pitch level, and the lilt of speech is in some sense similar to construct melodies.
I think the great wisdom from the 18th century and the earlier music, how can that contribute to music education today for maybe children or college students, graduate students? How can this information I really think is experiencing some kind of renaissance, how can we integrate it into modern music education?
Well, I mean, I think in order to do, I think you really hit on something here, because I really do think that music pedagogy is just beginning, just gotten the first little hint of a push to change. And I think, the future that I sort of dream of in music pedagogy is, people learn how to improvise early. Anybody who plays learns to also write and improvise. And in fact, people should probably learn a few different instruments, like piano and violin, or guitar and flute, or something like that. Maybe a harmonic instrument and a melodic instrument. That's not always practical, right? But I mean, what this gets at is that I think there are a lot of pedagogical focuses that have their root in sort of romantic pianists that have been toxic and damaging to pedagogy today. I mean, which is this emphasis on sort of accuracy and interpretation, and I've even heard of students being discouraged from improvising.
Oh yeah, I'm going to release a video of just accumulation of every interview I've done where I've asked them, like, what kind of pushback have you had? And there's quite a lot of stories, actually.
I think some of that is self-consciousness. I mean, I can recall an article about John Mortensen, where he,
the Guardian article? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He was recalling all of the sort of pushback he was getting, coming to speak at these places. And frankly, I imagine a lot of that is sort of old guard teachers who are sort of very, hurt.
Yeah, the story was the senior teacher couldn't improvise, so I think he was not invited, something like that.
Right. I mean, and it's truly, it's unforgivable. I mean, it's just a total ego trip. It's totally unhelpful to students. So, I mean, to answer the question, how can you be unhelpful to students? It's by being, arrogant and stubborn. So definitely don't do that. But anyway, I envision a world.
Have you seen a change, Nicola? And I think there has been a change in attitudes towards classical musicians improvising.
Totally, absolutely. I mean, more people. I mean, we've seen it ourselves. Just by the numbers and the number of people who have joined, the art of partimento and solfeggio and composition groups in the last 2 years. There's this huge groundswell of interest all of a sudden, and I'm finding every day more and more people. I actually just posted today. I found somebody who is writing in baroque style, and this is something I think we should all do because it's excellent music. And if you love it, then why wouldn't you learn as much about it as you possibly can?
Improvising is a great idea. How do we judge it? How do teachers judge it if we're able to integrate it into a curriculum? What's a good improvisation? What's a bad improvisation? At least if you try and interpret a piece, you can say, oh, there's wrong notes there, or it's a bit too robotic here and there. But how do we judge if an improvisation is good or not?
I think the same way that you would judge an improvised speech. Somebody is, they have a minute or two to convince you of something, and you're a reasonable person. Are they convincing you of this? Are the points that they've laid out clear? And one thing I find myself saying to people all the time is it's better to be boring than to speak gibberish. So it's much better to be boring than nonsensical. And so I would say, one of the most important things in improv, well, first is number one, pretend it's great, which is whatever you're doing, just smile and just pretend that you are a deity of music. even though pretty much every improviser I know hates themselves 100% of the time they're improvising. But beyond that, you should just try to, tell some type of story, make a convincing point. And if that's you, just switching between, sort of statements in different keys and sequences, fine. If your tempo is the same and that structure makes sense, perhaps it's a little boring, perhaps it's even a little formulaic. I think that's more forgivable than somebody sort of wandering around in the dark who, for 20 seconds, plays a few interesting chords that capture your attention.
What are the challenges that you found students who perhaps, when they're trying to learn according to these principles, what are the common things that you find that maybe we could touch on?
Well, the most common difficulty I run into as a teacher is when people have they would like to learn to improvise, but lack a very strong foundation in the instrument that they would like to improvise on, and I find that to be a prerequisite. It's not impossible to learn these things at the same time, which of course, which is why there's hope for children of the future. But how do we integrate improvisation? I think first of all, like we said, don't discourage it. And perhaps, require it. If you tell people to sort of just play, most of them will be able to do it. And perhaps, it's terrible. But getting used to just playing and feeling around, from there, already you have a ton to begin with. And you can start asking them questions like, well, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking ahead? What did you think about, before you started playing? What are you trying to do? And then you can sort of edge them towards thinking about certain things. And eventually you can edge them towards thinking about structure and things like that. And if they're trying to improvise in a certain style, then you can, lead them towards, certain idioms and tropes. You can practice. You can practice harmonizing melodies and figuring basses and things like that. It's sort of like, starting with just some marble, and then you can sort of carve it out from there, depending on what you want to do.
Phases. You talked about phases that you were listening to. Can you tell, this is just a fun question, what phases have you gone through the last 5 years? I just want to know.
Yeah. So, amazingly, I think my sort of, obsessively do this composer for 2 years at a time, has faded into somewhat of a baroque eclecticism in the last 5 years. I've been, of course, listening to tons of Couperin, and I went through, I think, that phase. Lately, I actually, shamefully, haven't been listening to tons of music because I haven't taken the subway in about a year, and I haven't driven a car since September. But I'm doing the opera Teseo at Juilliard at the moment, and so I've of course been listening to a lot of that, and that sort of piqued my interest back in Handel opera, which is basically a genre in and of itself.
I'm gonna you've got great opinions. I'm gonna mention a composer. I just want you to give me a short opinion. This will be the final fun thing. Okay, so all right, Handel. Give me your thoughts on Handel?
I'm incredibly jealous of Handel because of how quickly he could create music. I'm equally jealous of Talabot. I think Handel, like a lot of great composers, has a certain gift for economy. And it's clear from his writing that he knew enough general things that would work. He knew enough sort of general principles and how to apply them, things like, certain melodic contours and certain sort of harmonic areas and certain structures, and he wielded them liberally. I think it's clear when Handel either got particularly lucky or inspired or spent a little bit of extra time. For example, the Messiah, Giulio Cesare, just to name a few, and some of the late oratorios like Jephthah. And I think it's very clear when he spent a little bit of extra time, and I find myself wishing that he did that all the time. But of course, he didn't always have that luxury. And I also appreciate his readiness, I guess, to recycle things. His oeuvre is a big old recycling bin. And there's a fun comment in the Langlois manuscript. And I was lucky enough to have a conversation with the author of that book, who's a very, very nice guy with the name of Bill Renwick. But there's a comment in there which says that, because the authorship of these preludes and fugues is unknown. And there's a comment that, it's really, the style is really not so dissimilar from Handel, but we know it couldn't have been Handel because there's no way that Handel would have written 50 fugue subjects and not reused a single one.
Oh, wow, that's great. Okay, let's jump to Golden Age of Partimento. What do you think of Leo and Durante?
I am not, shamefully, so familiar with their work enough. I mean, I give them as exercises, but I haven't played through all of them in a while, and don't feel like I should form an opinion on them.
Okay, how about Corelli? We touched about him briefly, but what do you think of Arcangelo Corelli? I
mean, Corelli is sort of like the sort of invented Baroque music in a sense. I mean, maybe some people would say Monteverdi did, and of course, the claim X person invented X music is always questionable. But I mean, Corelli is somebody who was admired universally by people that we tend to admire more these days. I mean, Bach, of course, had plenty of copies of Corelli. Handel, Couperin openly praised Corelli multiple times in his prefaces and wrote a whole suite dedicated to him, the Apotheosis of Corelli. And he was also the composer who's been in print, I think, the longest. I mean, uninterrupted publications of his trio sonatas they've been printed since they came out in the 17th century. I think the reason for that is because of how clear these, sort of constructional and harmonic ideas become. I mean, very specifically, I think, there's a certain construction that I like to teach students, which is that, sort of Baroque music at its core is basically just a collection of, subjects or themes, episodes or sequences, and cadences. And Corelli embodies that quite literally. I mean, his music is pretty much just a collection of theme statements, sequences, and cadences. And it's a miracle what you can accomplish with that. And then from there, you can see what others have taken from that sort of simple construction and what they've done with it. And you can see how they get sort of, these more complicated sounding things. But they're really just Corellian at their core, I think.
What about Vivaldi?
Vivaldi, I think, is possibly the most charming composer who ever lived. His incredible musical charisma is probably without rival. He was, I think, a bit of a slob when it came to, part writing and, certain things like that. I mean, you find, you'll find counterpoint mistakes all over Vivaldi. You'll find very sort of awkwardly, proportioned chords. You'll find very boring, like viola parts. And, this is not the mark of somebody who didn't know what they were doing. This is the mark of somebody who is extremely busy and knew how to wield their good education in a similar way that Handel did, except I think Handel had less to do. I mean, Vivaldi was teaching for most of the day and was still, required to compose an absurd amount of music, not only for, the ospedale that he taught at, but, for other important functions for courts. I mean, for churches. I mean, he was engaged, in sort of, he had his finger in all sort of aspects of music making at that time. And somebody who had the sheer number of responsibilities that Vivaldi did, I mean, didn't have the luxury of poring over every single thing. And I think it's actually a luxury that Bach had more than other composers.
What about Rameau?
Oh my God. What can you say about Rameau? I mean, he was brilliant, totally brilliant. Probably my favorite quote by Rameau is that he was taking a walk in old age, and I forget who he said this to, but he said, as I get older, I have more and more good taste and less genius. And I don't know. I mean, to me, that says a lot about, that it shows me, for one thing, that is a guy who's just constantly self-checking and evaluating and constantly trying to improve in a very similar way, to all of, to a lot of the greatest composers that we admire, like Bach. And he really cared a great deal about, doing music, I think, the right way, what he thought was the right way, and spent a good deal of time, of course, theorizing about it, and was brilliant. One of my professors here, and the incredible lute player, Charlie Weaver, considers Rameau to be the greatest composer who ever lived.
This is a little bit earlier than the 18th century. This is, is this too early, Frescobaldi?
Oh, no, it's one of my favorites.
Okay.
It's never too early for Frescobaldi, and it's already 11:30, so it's not early at all. Um, Frescobaldi is one of those people who Bach, copied around, and I think sort of learned to push notes around partially from Frescobaldi. The counterpoint knowledge that guy wielded was remarkable, and I think his compositions are, really stand out to me in a time when, I think a lot of people were writing sort of more, mannerist, for lack of a better word, music. There are guys like, Caccini and sort of thing, and that trend was sort of beginning. People were sort of writing more what we consider now to be, quote unquote, Italian Baroque style, this very sort of gestural, in your face, kind of music. And Frescobaldi was busy writing, these crazy, fantasias and stuff that just do the most wild contrapuntal acrobatics, and also work splendidly as pieces of music. So yeah, I adore Frescobaldi.
Is there a composer that we haven't mentioned that really on this broadcast we should mention for young musicians to just maybe as someone you really love that you can advocate for?
Oh, we've talked about a lot of composers. I think one that we haven't talked about is William Byrd, and I consider William Byrd to be possibly the only composer who never wrote anything even close to. There are many composers who didn't write anything bad, or at least many composers who we don't have anything bad that they wrote. But I think William Byrd is perhaps the most consistently high quality for me personally. Whether it's a tiny little 2-part organ verset or whether it's, a 5-part mass, William Byrd, I think, showed, just an exquisite ability to compose effectively and melodically in a time, when polyphony was abound. And I have nothing but respect for Byrd. He's got to be in my top 3.
Wow, that's awesome. What can I say? Well, it's been a real delight to speak with the great Nicola Canzano. Please check out his first book on Partimenti. You can download a free PDF from IMSLP. You can even buy the book in a beautiful hardcover print, right, Nicola? You can get the hardcover.
You don't even need to buy it. You just need to pay the shipping. But there's not many of them left. I think I have 8.
I'll get your copy soon, everyone. Okay, 8 copies left. Now, Nicola, please tell my audience your plans for 2021 and how they can contact you if they want more information.
Oh, well, you can always reach me by private message on Facebook. And hopefully in 2021, I'm going to really put a lot of elbow grease into this group of mine, Nuova Practica, and we're going to try to get some great recordings of all of the wonderful work we've been doing, writing and improvising and performing our stuff together. And I can't wait to share it with the world. So we're going to hopefully get some recording projects under the way by the summer, and that'll be the focus, hopefully through the rest of this year.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Nicola. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nikhil. See ya.